And this was an adult coach who was about to get on a plane to go on an international trip with a minor athlete. But because of this aunt's report, the organization responsible for safeguarding was able to step in, get that coach out of sport before the trip was ever taken.
So today's video topic is a heavy one, but an important one for all of you sports parents, coaches, athletes, and administrators. We're going to talk about how to prevent sexual abuse and grooming behavior in sports. So we have a guest, an expert on this. Bobby Click is an attorney with the Employment Matters Flynn Investigations Group, and he is the executive director of sports safety. And he presents workshops all over the country, helping organizations put down policies and get everything in line so that they can have good codes of conduct, all sorts of things to keep their athletes safe from sexual abuse. And yes, this video is a departure from my normal content, but I consider this a public service because I really want to get this important information out so we can protect kids from the predators who are out there. And so that's why I wanted to bring in Bobby Click to share his expertise on this important topic. For people who don't necessarily know the official definition of the word, what it looks like, can you give us a good definition of grooming?
Yeah, and that's a great question because it's referred to in a couple different contexts and different ways. But for me, when I refer to grooming, especially in the context of sport, I am talking about intentional, methodical actions taken by an adult to put themselves in a position to sexually abuse a minor or young adult, and that usually involves creating an environment of trust between the youth or young adult, the coach, and then also the community and the family of that young adult.
So I watched one of your presentations live at a sports conference in New Orleans. And one of the things you discussed at length was that these people essentially hide in plain sight. So do you have tips about identifying that sort of behavior?
Yeah, one of to me, the biggest red flags or key indicators of potential grooming is that isolation you're talking about, right? When a coach or an adult starts to isolate one individual away from a group, away from their support structures, right? This can be one-on-one interactions, sometimes tied directly to the sport or not, right? So we're looking for things like private transportation without others are present, right? We're looking for one-on-one training sessions. We're also looking at things where there may be one-on-one communications outside the context of sport, right? So for me, an organization has to have policies in place looking to mitigate or limit that possibility of isolation, right? Whether that is having other adults present or having things being done in group settings. And it's so important for parents to really ask questions and insist on transparency and the training and the environments that are present to try to really mitigate the opportunity for isolation, right? Because that is one of to me, the biggest red flags that I've seen present in so many different cases where grooming led to sexual abuse.
So one of the things you also discussed in your presentations is that these people will try to be everyone's best friend. They're often charming. They're trying to build trust. But then they're going to start breaking rules and crossing over boundaries, like you said. So what should people be looking for? You mentioned trying to isolate, but what are some other specifics that people should be looking for if they're trying to notice this before something happens?
Yeah, it's a great point. You're exactly right. It starts off as this innocent, what seems like just supportive and truly caring, behaviors, right? That's what makes grooming so difficult to recognize. But what the abuser is often doing is starting to bend or, skirt organizational policies, doing things like using personal communication channels to communicate with the athletes, right? So in a lot of situations now, the teams have their own reporting communication, whether that's, Team Slack or Team Stack or whatever they are, all these different things out there that they're supposed to be using for the organization, but they'll start sending private text messages or Snapchat or WhatsApp or using these different methods, right? Bending, but not, and skirting those rules. And that behavior really starts to erode or break down the safeguards that are in place, right? Parents have to understand there are reasons that we have these communication barriers and safeguards in place, and that there need to be enforced and addressed immediately. If you notice things like, the coach is sending a message on Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp, and that's not the channel that the team is supposed to be using.
Okay. Yeah. So they have this big departure from the typical team communications, whether it's email or a group chat or something like that, where everyone's included, and it really starts to become singled out and, marching down that line.
Yeah, that's exactly right. When you think about isolating the athlete, which is one of those big red flags, that isolation can be virtual or physical. And one way that it happens in the virtual world is starting to initiate those one-on-one electronic communications through personal communications channels, right? It's starting to build additional trust with that athlete, show that athlete that they're communicating with them in a way they typically communicate outside of the typical method. So yeah, so that's something definitely parents in this digital world we live in have to be on the lookout for.
So speaking of parents, tell me about the role of the family, because as you talked about in your workshop, it's not just the athlete, but they're charming. They sort of bring in the whole community. They start to become often friends with the family. Tell me what parents should be looking for as far as their relationship with a coach.
Yes, even in that definition, that just kind of brief definition I gave you of grooming, the target of grooming is not always the target of the abuse, right? What I mean by that is abusers will often groom parents or guardians or communities, and they're looking to build trust with that family to lower their guard, right? They'll all start providing services to the athlete or the family, whether that is starting to provide rides, gifting to the athlete if they realize that there may be some financial issues, offering free or discounted one-on-one trainings to really elevate, right? They're trying to put themselves in a position to where they become almost indispensable to the athlete's success or development, and just really a benefit to the family itself, right? You know, it's difficult. Parents have a lot of responsibilities, and when you add sports on top of that, those abusers can often try to take advantage of that need. So for me, at least, organizations and parents really have to go back to education, but then also really educating on what appropriate professional boundaries are, right? What a coach's behavior should be and what it shouldn't be. And by helping the parents understand that, then they can be on the lookout for like, hey, I think this is potentially crossing a line, because what we learn is that grooming is a process. It can often be a long process, which means that if a parent or an organization starts to understand more what grooming is, what the purpose of it is, they can step in at any point during that process and stop it, right? Which means they can prevent abuse, or they can prevent abuse from continuing.
As far as the actual behavior, the way the coach interacts with the player, potential abuser interacts with the player when they're with the team versus when they're not with the team. What do you see in your investigations? Like, how did they interact? How does the potential abuser's behavior change when they're alone with the athlete versus with everyone else sort of in public?
Yeah. So for me, they are going to, if there's an abuser in the mix here, they're often going to behave differently when they're around others, right? They're going to appear professional. They're going to often appear distant, right? But they're with the group. But when you start to see them in one-on-one or limited interactions, you're going to see a lot more familiarity, a lot more physical interaction, right? They may be more hands-on with the, arm around the shoulder, arm around the hip, right? A lot more hugging, things of that nature. And I will say that one of the pieces that becomes a little bit more apparent in the group setting, especially for parents to be able to pick out, is if there seems to be a specific target of differing conduct, right? So even in the group setting, they may appear professional or distant for the most part, but parents may start to see that there is specific favoritism towards one athlete, right? Maybe the coach lingers or gives additional compliments or exaggerated compliments towards one athlete, but it can also be exaggerated critiques or distancing from that specific athlete, right? When you're in a group setting, what I often tell people to look for is, is there any athlete that appears to be treated differently, positively or negatively by that coach? And then once that shifts to one-on-one contact, pay special attention to see how that behavior changes, right? Is there additional physical contact, things of that nature? Because that can be real indicators that that youth or that athlete has become a target of grooming and potential sexual abuse.
Now, I know you've done a lot of investigations and you have a lot of really heavy stories, but can you share something that helps people? Just give us an example of an investigation, a story that you've been through that can illustrate some of these points to help drive them home.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of cases, right? I've seen a lot of cases where the grooming behaviors were noticed too late, right? And the impact on these athletes is just tremendous and devastating. There's a great example, an example of success where there was a real involved aunt, right? And she started noticing some subtle signs in her nephew's behavior, right? He seemed to be a little withdrawn from the family, a little overly attached to his coach. And so she started to pay a little extra attention, and she started noticing that this coach was sending a lot of text messages, right? And at first, she's close to her nephew. She would read some of these text messages. They seemed harmless, but it started to raise concerns. And she had been through some training in grooming because she had this child protective background. So it started to raise red flags for her, right? And so she started to open up more lines of communications with her nephew, right? Started to talk to him a little bit more. Started to ask him about what's going on, right? And the nephew just talked, right? Didn't see anything wrong. Started talking about these text messages. And all of a sudden it seemed like there's lines being crossed. This is becoming more appropriate, right? And she reached out and reported, to the appropriate authorities when this final message she saw was like, I'm really looking forward to this trip with you. What happens in this trip is just between us. Don't tell your parents what happens on the trip, right? And so the aunt made this report. The family starts to get more involved. They start to look at more text messages, right? And then all of a sudden we notice that there's text messages of a sexual nature in there, right? And this was an adult coach who was about to get on a plane to go on an international trip with a minor athlete. But because of this aunt's report, the organization responsible for safeguarding was able to step in, get that coach out of sport before the trip was ever taken. That was a situation where even after interviews with the youth was like, hey, no, there was no abuse that ever occurred. Like there was no physical contact, no sexual abuse. But it was really clear after you put the timeline together, but if you put the messages together, that this was a progressive grooming situation where sexual abuse was almost inevitable. And because of this aunt was vigilant, right? And she was willing to get involved, willing to open up those lines of communication with her nephew, made the report when it was necessary. That coach was removed from sport. The abuse didn't occur. And that youth was able to move forward and continue enjoying sport to this day.
That's a powerful story. And, we both know these can be just devastating and have such long-term psychological effects for, the victim. So that's great to hear that someone was able to intervene before it happened, which is great. Bobby, can you tell us a little bit about the workshops that you do? Obviously, the reason we're having this dialogue, this is a heavy topic, right? But we're both here to protect as many kids as we can, spread the word, and you're doing this work in the community. Can you share a little bit for those who are maybe watching as a coach, as a parent, as a sports organization, what it is that you do out in the community and how you can maybe help them?
Yeah, so look, sports are so important to everybody, right? Myself included. I have young kids who play sports. I played sports still to this day. And what my group does, which is sports safety, is focus on helping youth serving in sports organizations exclusively prevent abuse and then respond to abuse if they receive some allegations, right? It's so important for both of those things to be happening. We have to focus on abuse prevention, which means I just like what we're talking about, I help educate the community on signs of abuse, prevention for abuse, like setting up the appropriate policies and procedures. And then if something does get reported, how they can appropriately handle that to ensure that they're mitigating the risk to the community moving forward, but also, supporting those survivors that have, really come forward and reported the abuse. So that's what we're here to do. We're here to make sure that sports are a supportive and safe environment, knowing all the benefits that are out there. You mentioned, how damaging just the impact of abuse can be. But man, those positive benefits of sport, when it's that safe and supportive environment, are just unbelievable as well. And that's what we're here to do. We're here to make sure that every environment is as safe as possible, supportive as possible, because every kid, every participant deserves to have that, type of environment when they're playing sports.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Bobby, thanks so much for your time. For you watching at home, you can check out resources and find how to get in touch with Bobby Click and in the description below. So again, this is this is a departure from my typical content, but we're doing this in conjunction with Mr. Click so that we can spread awareness of some of these, sports safety issues. So thanks again for watching. Be sure to follow up with him in the resources in the description below.